The HOA stole my water rights to build their shiny new power plant, claiming I had plenty to give. They didn't ask, they didn't negotiate, they just took. And when their arrogance dried up my land and left my spring a cracked, empty scar, I decided to take back what was mine. I'm just a quiet widower, they said, harmless, soft. But they had no idea I knew every inch of this land, its secrets, its power. When I finally unleashed the flood they never saw coming, it wasn't sabotage, it was justice, and this time, they were the ones left drowning. I moved out here for the quiet. After 30 years working as a structural engineer, I wanted something simple. Land I could care for, water I could hear, sky I could actually see. My wife and I found this place together. 10 acres of rolling fields, thick woods along the southern edge, and a spring-fed stream that ran clear even in the hottest summers. We'd planned to grow old here. She made it 5 years before the cancer took her. After that, it was just me and the land. I kept it up, the way she would have wanted. The gardens were neat, the grass was cut. The little bench under the oak tree was stained every spring, like clockwork. That spring water, though, that was the heart of it. It was the reason we chose this place. She used to say it sounded like forever. For a long time, nobody bothered me. Riverstone Gardens was a newer development, mostly tidy two-story houses with matching shutters and perfectly trimmed hedges. The HOA kept it themselves. They didn't cross the old property line. I paid my minimal dues. They left me alone. That was the deal. Then Karen arrived. She came sweeping in from the city in her spotless white Range Rover, all designer sunglasses and expensive smiles. Bought the largest house on Oakwood Drive, slapped on a coat of eggshell paint that made the neighbors whisper, and somehow, within 6 months, ended up president of the HOA. The kind of president who didn't just enforce rules, she made them up as she went along. At first, it was small things. Memos about lawn gnome removal, notices about mailbox heights, restrictions on garden colors to match the HOA-approved palette. People grumbled, but they paid their fines. Then came the community beautification projects, sweeping plans to install solar panels, repave the streets, build a new park. Everyone got glossy flyers in their mailboxes, complete with Karen's photo and a paragraph about preserving property values. And then, she found my spring. I remember the first time I caught her standing at the edge of my land, clipboard in hand, staring at the water like it was already hers. She gave me that thin, practiced smile of hers and said, "You've got plenty to give, Mr. Reynolds." And I knew, right then, my quiet life was over. I still remember the exact moment the letter came. A crisp white envelope slipped into my mailbox on a Tuesday morning. The HOA's official letterhead was printed in deep green ink, the kind of formal branding they loved to use when they were about to tell you something you wouldn't like. I stood there a while, holding it in my hands, feeling the weight of it. Somehow I already knew. I tore it open right there at the mailbox. 4 pages, carefully worded, thick with legalese and condescension. They called it the Asterisk Riverstone Gardens Community Hydroelectric and Water Conservation Project Asterisk. They called it progress. I called it theft. It wasn't just the spring they were after. It was my land, my water, the heart of this place. Karen's letter said the board had voted unanimously to utilize underutilized natural resources within the community boundaries. My spring apparently counted as community property. I stood in the driveway for a long time, rereading the section that said I had plenty to give, as though they were doing me a favor, as though I owed them something. The next day, Karen showed up herself, clipboard in hand, immaculate as always, a cream-colored suit, designer sunglasses pushed into her perfectly styled blonde hair. She walked straight up my driveway like she owned the place. "Mr. Reynolds," she smiled, holding out a manicured hand I didn't bother to shake. "You received our notice?" I nodded. "This isn't your land." Her smile twitched but didn't falter. "Your property includes a valuable natural spring that can benefit everyone in Riverstone Gardens. It's just sitting here." She waved a hand like she was blessing the land. "Our engineers say it produces more than you need." "It's mine," I said, "and it's staying that way." Her lips pressed together. She tapped her clipboard. "Section 12, paragraph 7, of the HOA charter you signed when you bought the property states that any natural resources located within community boundaries can be repurposed for the benefit of the neighborhood." She recited it like scripture. "It's all perfectly legal, Mr. Reynolds." I didn't answer. I just watched as two men in polo shirts and khakis began placing survey stakes by the spring's edge. Karen turned back to me with a thin smile. "You've got plenty to give," she said again, softer now, almost like a threat. "And we're here to make sure you do." The first stake showed up 2 days later. A bright orange ribbon flapping in the breeze, tied around a thin wooden post driven deep into the earth just a few feet from my back fence. At first, I thought it was a mistake, some overeager contractor marking the wrong spot. But by the end of the day, there were more. Dozens. Neatly aligned in a line that snaked along the tree line and across my lower pasture, cutting through my garden like a knife. I spent an hour pacing along them, following the path they carved out of my land, and the knot in my stomach grew tighter with every step. These weren't random markers. They were claiming territory, land that had been mine for 15 years, land I'd paid for, maintained, cared for. The markers pushed the boundary line nearly 50 feet inward, swallowing the stream, the spring, and half the garden my wife and I had planted together before she passed. I went inside, pulled out the old property deed from the fireproof box I kept in the office closet, spread it out on the dining table. The lines were clear as day. My boundary followed the edge of the stream, not the middle of it, and certainly not 50 feet away from it. I'd walked those lines 100 times. I knew every inch of it. I drove down to the county assessor's office the next morning, deed in hand. The clerk was polite but distracted as she scrolled through the records on her screen. Then she frowned. "According to this," she said, squinting, "that area was rezoned as green space last month. HOA managed common area." I stared at her. "That's impossible," I said flatly. "I own that land." She clicked a few more times. "You should have received notice, certified mail." She looked up at me, apologetic. "That's what the system says." I hadn't received anything. Neither had any of my neighbors when I asked them later that evening. Ted Johnson, who lived closest to me, scratched his head and said he got something about community improvements, but threw it away. Karen had buried the rezoning in a pile of junk mail, counting on everyone being too busy or too trusting to read the fine print. I realized then this wasn't an accident. It was a land grab, and they thought I wouldn't notice. The HOA meeting minutes showed the vote passed by a landslide. That's what Karen told me when I cornered her at one of those forced smile HOA-sponsored barbecues she liked to throw on Oakwood Drive. "We followed the rules, Mr. Reynolds," she said, holding a plastic cup of lemonade like she was a friendly neighbor and not a thief. 37 in favor, 3 opposed. The rest abstained. She said it like it was settled fact, carved in stone, beyond question. But something didn't sit right. Riverstone Gardens had over 120 households. 37 votes shouldn't have been enough to approve a project this big, especially one that meant taking private property and turning it into a community asset. I went home that night and pulled out the HOA bylaws, page after page of tedious language. But there it was, tucked between maintenance regulations and meeting protocols. Any project involving the seizure or repurposing of homeowner property required a supermajority vote. 67% of all homeowners had to agree, not just 37 people who bothered to show up. That wasn't just an oversight. It was a rigged game. I started knocking on doors. Not just the neighbors I was friendly with, but everyone. The retirees who stayed out of things, the young couple who just moved in, the folks who kept to themselves on Pine Hollow Lane. Most said the same thing. Either they'd never received anything about a vote, or they tossed the packet without reading it. Karen had mailed it in the same envelope as the community newsletter and the usual flood of HOA notices about recycling violations and grass height restrictions. She knew most people tuned that junk out. She counted on it. But a few people did remember. Ted Johnson dug his out of his recycling bin. It was pages and pages of meaningless filler about community improvements, but buried on page 9 was the rezoning notice in 6-point font and a ballot that said, "If we do not receive your response by the deadline, your vote will be considered an abstention in favor of the majority decision." That's how she got her overwhelming approval. Homeowner apathy had given her the numbers she needed, or at least the illusion of them. It wasn't just shady, it was deliberate. And as I stood there with a stack of evidence growing on my kitchen table, I realized something else. Karen didn't think anyone would care enough to fight her. The morning they rolled in, it was still dark. I was sipping my coffee, standing at the kitchen window when the first headlights cut across the field. At first, I thought maybe it was just maintenance trucks, someone checking the power lines after last night's windstorm. But then I heard the low rumble of diesel engines and the metallic clatter of treads on gravel. bulldozers, excavators, a cement truck. They parked along my fence line like they owned the place, hissing and groaning as they powered down, steam curling from their vent into the cold morning air. I stepped outside, the grass still damp under my boots. Karen was there already, standing at the edge of the property with her clipboard and her perfect hair, and that tight little smile she wore when she thought she was winning. "Mr. Reynolds," she called cheerfully as if we were old friends, "you're just in time." "In time for what?" I asked, though I already knew. "For progress," she said, gesturing to the men climbing out of the trucks. "Today's the big day. We're breaking ground on the Riverstone Gardens hydroelectric project." I stood there in the cold while they unloaded backhoes and jackhammers. One of them carried bright orange tubing, the kind they'd run into a natural water source. My water source. They were moving fast, too fast for this to be a first step. Pipes were laid out, concrete forms already framed, heavy equipment positioned like they'd been planning this for weeks. Because they had. By noon, they had trenches cut through my pasture and a foundation poured where my wildflowers used to grow. A massive concrete basin took shape at the edge of the stream, rerouting the water away from its natural flow and into a system of steel pipes. The spring, that had trickled quietly for generations, now rushed into a turbine housing the size of a shed. The sound was wrong. Too loud, too mechanical. I used to stand by that spring and hear nothing but birds in the breeze. Now all I heard was machinery. Karen strolled up beside me, watching the backhoe dig deep into the hillside where I'd planted the magnolia tree my wife loved. "You'll thank me for this someday," she said. "Lower HOA fees, renewable energy, progress." Her voice was syrupy, but her eyes were cold, and all I could think was how fast things break when people stop listening. I spent the next 2 days making calls. Long ones, short ones, desperate ones. I dug through old files, dusted off my wife's filing cabinet, and hunted down every shred of documentation that proved what I already knew. This was my land, my spring, my water. And they were stealing it in broad daylight. The first lawyer I called sounded interested. He told me to bring in my deed and the HOA paperwork. I drove 45 minutes into town, papers in hand, hope wedged somewhere between my ribs. He flipped through my documents for maybe 5 minutes before closing the file and sliding it back across the desk. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reynolds," he said, not quite meeting my eye. "There's nothing I can do. The HOA charter you signed gives them wide authority." I pointed out the vague language, the missing votes, the rigged ballots. He nodded sympathetically. "You're not wrong, but this would take years to fight, and they have deeper pockets than you." I thanked him and left, called another, then another. 5 lawyers in 2 days. All of them said the same thing, though they used different words. Some said conflict of interest. Others admitted they had ongoing relationships with the Riverstone HOA. One even chuckled, leaning back in his chair like this was all a game. "Karen Miller," he said, shaking his head. "That woman's connected. I'm not getting in the middle of that." I tried the county next. The zoning board claimed they had no authority over HOA decisions. The assessor's office said the rezoning paperwork was in order and properly filed. I filed a formal complaint with the State Water Commission, citing unauthorized diversion of a private water source. They told me it could take up to 6 months just to open an investigation. By then, the spring would be dried up and the damage done. The last call I made was to a friend of mine, a retired cop who still had a few contacts at the state level. I asked him flat out if there was anything he could do. His silence on the line told me everything I needed to know. Karen's web ran deep, deeper than I'd ever expected. And I realized, sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by useless files and unread messages, that no one was coming to save me. I wasn't the kind of man to believe in luck, but when Eleanor Thompson knocked on my door late that afternoon, I started to think fortune might be shifting in my favor. She stood there in her raincoat, hair pulled back in its usual no-nonsense bun, her cane tucked under one arm, and a thick file clutched in the other. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. I stepped aside and let her in. Eleanor had lived in Riverstone Gardens longer than anyone, retired district judge, sharp as a tack even at 73. People respected her, or at least they used to, until Karen's HOA board started steamrolling the neighborhood. She sat down at my kitchen table like she'd lived there her whole life and spread out the file. "I've been watching her," Eleanor said, "and I've been documenting everything. Inside were meeting minutes that didn't match the official records. Financial statements full of questionable entries, signatures that, when Eleanor pointed them out, were clearly forged. "She's funneling HOA dues into private accounts," Eleanor said quietly, "and I have reason to believe she's been bribing the zoning board. That's how she got your land rezoned so quickly." I let that settle in for a minute before the knock came at the door. Rick Davis, the foreman of the construction crew, stood on my porch shifting uncomfortably, hat in hand. "Can I come in?" he asked. I wasn't sure, but something in his expression told me I should. He smelled faintly of diesel and wet concrete as he crossed the threshold. "I shouldn't be here," Rick said, glancing at Eleanor, then at me. "But I can't watch this happen." He told us Milestone Development, the contractor supposedly working for the HOA, wasn't just a construction company. It was owned by Thomas Miller, Karen's husband. "They're planning to use your spring as a test case," Rick said. "If they pull this off, they'll do it in other communities. Already have applications in for 3 new developments." Eleanor's expression darkened. "They're setting legal precedent," she muttered. "If they prove they can seize private water rights through HOA charters, they can make a fortune." Rick nodded. "And they're rushing to finish before anyone can stop them." He slid a folded piece of paper across the table. "Here's their construction timeline and a list of suppliers. You'll want this." For the first time in weeks, I felt something like hope, and a rising determination that they'd picked the wrong man to steal from. I stayed up late that night. The blueprints Rick handed me spread out across the dining table like a crime scene. My old engineering instincts kicked in fast, scanning the schematics for mistakes, weak points, anything that could explain why Karen and Thomas Miller were pushing so hard to finish before the rainy season hit. It didn't take long to see it. A flaw so basic, so arrogant, it made my jaw tighten. They'd designed their system for efficiency, not resilience. The concrete reservoir, the turbines, the automated control valves. They looked impressive on paper, but they weren't built to withstand heavy rainfall. The overflow channel was too narrow. The emergency bypass was routed through a culvert meant for landscaping drainage, not stormwater. If there was too much pressure in the system, their fancy automated valves were supposed to regulate the flow, keep everything balanced, except they wouldn't. I ran the numbers twice just to be sure. If the water volume spiked too high, too fast, say during a major storm, the system wouldn't just fail, it would rupture. Worst case scenario, the main valve would fail open instead of closed. All that pressurized water would flood straight downhill, right through Oakwood Drive, where Karen and the rest of the HOA board had built their pristine homes. By dawn, the storm warnings started rolling in. I watched the local news as the weatherman pointed at swirling red graphics on his map and used words like record-breaking rainfall and unprecedented water levels. I sipped my coffee and stared out the window at the gathering clouds, wondering how far I was willing to let this go. Ana Jimenez, the out-of-county lawyer Eleanor found for us, called later that morning. "We're close," she said. "I'll have the injunction paperwork ready by Monday. Just hold tight." But Monday might be too late. I walked my property that afternoon, checking the drainage channels I'd quietly cleared and reshaped. Perfectly legal. After all, I had every right to manage the water on my own land. I rerouted runoff from my roof, my garden, my gravel paths, funneled everything toward the springhead. Let gravity do the work. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I wasn't touching their system. I was just letting nature take its course. And Karen? Well, Karen was about to learn you can only push so far before something breaks. The rain started just after midnight, steady at first, then heavier by the hour. By dawn, sheets of water hammered my roof in a deafening rhythm. I stood by the kitchen window watching rivulets stream down the glass. The gutters I'd rerouted were doing their job perfectly, funneling runoff straight into the spring, swelling its flow far beyond what it was ever meant to handle. Nature was waking up, and it was angry. By noon, the turbines down by the reservoir were whining like wounded animals, their pitch higher than I'd ever heard. I slipped on my rain jacket and hiked up to the ridge where I could see the entire setup. Water churned through the system in a frothing brown rush. The concrete basin was already brimming, spilling into the overflow channel faster than the narrow culvert could carry it. Red warning lights flashed along the control panel. I recognized the siren that started then, an automated system alert. Too much pressure, not enough release. The main valve was supposed to stay closed under these conditions, regulating flow into the turbines. But as Miguel, the contractor who owed me a favor, had warned me, it was never designed to handle this kind of surge. Karen and Thomas had skimped on the materials, cutting corners to save money. Now the price was coming due. With a sound like a gunshot, the main valve blew wide open. I watched as a solid wall of water surged into the emergency bypass, straight downhill toward Oakwood Drive. I didn't move for a moment, just stood there, soaked to the bone, as nature took back everything they'd stolen from it. By the time I made it down to Oakwood, the water was knee-high and rising. Karen's palatial front yard had transformed into a brown, swirling river. Her white SUV bobbed against her. Ornamental garden fence like a child's toy in a bathtub. Water poured through the front door of her house, smashing furniture against the walls inside. I called 911. Not because I had to, but because it was the right thing to do. Emergency services scrambled to evacuate residents, while the HOA board members stood in their driveways, drenched and helpless. Karen caught sight of me through the rain, her perfect mask cracking. She knew, and I knew she knew, this wasn't sabotage. This was nature, and this was justice. The rain finally stopped 2 days later. By then, Oakwood Drive looked less like a neighborhood and more like the aftermath of a war zone. Waterlogged furniture piled up on curbs. Sandbags surrounded what was left of the HOA clubhouse, though nothing could save the files inside. Soggy records, rotting checkbooks, years of carefully curated power turned to pulp. And Karen? She was nowhere to be seen. Not at the HOA's hastily called emergency meetings, not even on the sidewalks where she used to parade her power like a pageant queen. But I knew where she was, sitting behind closed doors with her lawyer, watching everything crumble. It didn't take long. The flood had done more than destroy property. It had opened people's eyes. Neighbors who'd once been silent started talking. Eleanor spearheaded the effort, gathering affidavits from residents who'd been bullied, fined, and ignored. Miguel provided engineering reports proving the system's failure wasn't an act of God but gross negligence. And Ana Jimenez? She brought the hammer down. The county commissioner recused himself from the investigation within days of our complaint, and suddenly things moved fast. Subpoenas were issued, bank accounts frozen. Emails between Karen and Thomas surfaced, outlining their plans to siphon profits from the hydroelectric project into shell companies. There were messages instructing the HOA treasurer to lose meeting notices and reword ballots. My favorite was an email Karen sent 2 weeks before the flood, bragging about making an example out of me. The day the FBI showed up at Karen's house was sunny for a change. I watched from my front porch as 2 black SUVs parked at the curb, agents in windbreakers escorting Karen out in handcuffs. Her expensive blouse was stained at the collar, her hair flat and damp. No cameras, no press, just quiet shame. The rest of the board resigned within a week. Some fled the state. Others tried to beg forgiveness, but there was no HOA left to shield them. The entire organization was dismantled under court order. Elections would be held in 6 months under strict oversight. I never planned to run, but neighbors kept asking. And after what we'd all been through, I figured someone ought to make sure it never happened again. The reckoning had come. And for the first time in years, Riverstone Gardens belonged to the people who lived there, not to those who thought they owned it. The first time I saw the spring running clear again, I almost didn't recognize it. For months, it had been choked by their machinery. Pipes jammed into its banks, its flow twisted and redirected until it barely whispered anymore. But now it gushed, steady and strong, the way it used to when my wife and I first found this place. I knelt by the edge, cupping the cold water in my hands. It tasted like freedom. The demolition crews finished tearing out the last of the concrete a week after Karen was arrested. The turbines were hauled away, the reservoir jackhammered into rubble. Miguel oversaw the removal himself, making sure the land wasn't scarred any more than it already was. Once they left, I got to work. I replanted native grasses and flowers along the banks, the kinds that had always grown here before they decided they knew better. I rebuilt the old stone path my wife had loved, the one that wound from the garden down to the oak tree by the spring. And when the heron returned, gliding down at dusk to stand knee-deep in the water, I stood there and watched in silence, feeling something close to peace. The land was healing. So was the neighborhood. Eleanor chaired the interim HOA board, with Anna acting as legal counsel. They rewrote the bylaws from scratch. Every clause, every rule, voted on in public meetings where nothing was hidden. No secret ballots, no fine print. The new charter protected property rights, limited board power, and banned any future rezoning without unanimous consent from affected homeowners. It was a start. When they asked me to serve on the Environmental Oversight Committee, I said yes. Not because I wanted the job, but because someone had to keep an eye on things. Someone who remembered what happened when people stopped paying attention. We turned the spring area into a community preserve. Open trails, but no development. Just quiet paths where people could walk, sit, think. Some days I found kids fishing along the banks. Other days, neighbors brought lawn chairs and books. I didn't mind. It felt right. The land was back where it belonged. So was the water. And when I stood there in the evening light, listening to the rush of the spring, I realized something simple and true. They thought they could take what wasn't theirs, but nature and justice always finds a way to take it back.